Welcome, friends, and settle in close tonight, for the road we walk together is a tender one, and it asks of us a special gentleness. Tonight we visit the resting places of gifted and beloved people who died by their own hand, who were taken from the world not by accident or illness of the body, but by that quiet, lying darkness that tells a suffering mind its pain will never end, and that the world would be better without it. Both of those things are lies, and every soul we visit tonight was proof of it, for each of them left behind a light that still shines, work that still moves us, a memory still cherished by millions who would give anything to have told them they mattered. I want to say clearly, before we take a single step, that we do not come here to dwell on how these people died. I will not describe it, and I will not linger on it, because the manner of a death is the least important and the least true thing about a life. We come instead to remember who they were, the beauty they made, the laughter they gave, the private battles they fought so much longer and more bravely than anyone knew, and to stand quietly at their graves and tell them, too late but sincerely, that they are not forgotten. The illness that took them has a name, and it is not weakness, and it is not selfishness, and it is not sin. It is despair, a real and treatable affliction of the mind, and it has reached into every kind of life, the rich and the poor, the celebrated and the unknown, the young and the old, sparing no one on the basis of talent or fortune or love. That is part of what makes these stories so heartbreaking. That people who seem to have everything, whose gifts brought joy to the whole world, could be so alone inside their own suffering. If, as we walk, you find these stories weighing on you, be gentle with yourself, and know that the darkness lies to everyone it touches, and that help is real, and that no life is ever the burden that the illness insists it is. We will visit 30 of these souls across the whole of our journey, 15 tonight and 15 when next we walk together, and we will treat every one of them with the tenderness they deserve. There is one more thing I want you to carry with you as we walk. It would be easy, hearing story after story of gifted and famous people brought to such an end, to come away believing that success cannot protect anyone, and in a narrow sense that is true. But the deeper truth is kinder and more hopeful than that. Almost every soul we visit tonight was suffering from an illness that, understood and treated, so many people survive and move beyond, going on to long and full and joyful lives. That these particular people did not is a tragedy, not an inevitability, and their stories are not a message of despair but a call to gentleness, toward others and toward ourselves. So let us walk not in gloom but in tenderness, honoring the beauty they left behind and letting their memory make us a little kinder to every struggling soul we meet, including the one we see in the mirror. So lower your voice, and take my arm, and let us go gently among them, beginning in a wheat field in France. With a painter, the world learned to love only after it was far too late to tell him. So lower your voice, and take my arm, and let us go gently among them, beginning in a wheat field in France. With a painter the world learned to love only after it was far too late to tell him. Let us begin at the small village cemetery of Auvers-sur-Oise, just outside Paris, where Vincent van Gogh lies beneath a simple stone blanketed in ivy, beside his beloved brother. In his lifetime, Van Gogh was a failure by every measure the world understood. A strange, intense, impoverished man who sold almost nothing, who was supported entirely by his devoted brother Theo, and who battled a savage mental illness that landed him, at his lowest, in an asylum. And yet in the fire of that suffering he produced, in barely a decade, some of the most luminous and beloved paintings in the history of art. The swirling stars, the blazing sunflowers, the golden wheat fields under troubled skies. In the summer of 1890, in the countryside near Auvers, at just 37, the darkness finally overtook him, and he died 2 days later with Theo at his side. Theo, shattered, followed him in death within months, and was later laid to rest right beside him, the two brothers together beneath matching stones. He had come to painting late, and taught himself, with a ferocious, almost desperate intensity, pouring his whole soul onto the canvas in thick, urgent strokes of color that seemed to vibrate with feeling, seeing beauty and meaning in the humblest things. A pair of worn boots, a chair, a starry night over a sleeping town. He longed all his life for connection, for love, for a community of fellow artists, and again it slipped from his grasp, leaving him lonelier and more fragile each time. He gave away his kindness freely and received so little in return. and the illness in his mind, which brought terrifying episodes he could neither understand nor control, made an ordinary life impossible. He sold, it is said, but a single painting while he lived. And yet today his works hang in the greatest museums on earth, and are known and loved by billions. His letters to Theo cherished as some of the most beautiful ever written, so that the failure he believed himself to be became, in time, perhaps the most beloved artist who ever lived. His final months were a frenzy of creation in the countryside north of Paris, where a kindly doctor watched over him, and in barely 70 days he produced some 70 paintings. Working with a speed and a fury that seemed to know his time was short, the wheat and the crows and the church and the sky pouring out of him. When the end came in that summer field, it was his brother Theo who rushed to his side and held him as he died. And Theo, who had believed in Vincent when no one else on earth did, was so broken by the loss that his own health collapsed, and he died only 6 months later. Years afterward, Theo's widow had his remains brought to Auvers and laid beside his brother's, and it was she who gathered up Vincent's paintings and his letters and carried them to the world, so that the two brothers, who had been everything to each other in life, lie side by side in death, their twin stones joined under a single blanket of ivy. He rests here now, the painter the world would come to adore too late. Let us travel now to a small mountain cemetery in Ketchum, Idaho, to the grave of Ernest Hemingway, one of the towering figures of American letters. Hemingway had built a legend of himself as the most robust of men, the hunter, the soldier, the deep-sea fisherman, the war correspondent, and his spare, muscular prose changed the course of literature and won him the Nobel Prize. But behind the larger-than-life image was a man tormented by depression, by heavy drinking, and by a family history of the same darkness that had claimed his father before him. In his final years, his body and mind failed him, and the treatments meant to heal him instead robbed him of his memory and his ability to write, which was the very thing he lived for. In the summer of 1961, at his home in Idaho, at 61, he took his own life. He was buried here in Ketchum, in the mountains he loved. He had lived enough for 10 men, driving ambulances in one world war and reporting from the front of another, running with the bulls, hunting big game in Africa, landing marlin in the Gulf Stream, and turning all of it into fiction so clean and so powerful that it remade the American sentence and inspired countless writers who came after. He seemed the very picture of vitality and courage, but the same sensitivity that made him a great artist left him vulnerable to a depression that deepened as he aged, worsened by decades of hard drinking and by injuries from 2 plane crashes that left him in constant pain. His father had died the same way, and so, in the years to come, would a sister, a brother, and a granddaughter, a shadow that seemed to haunt the whole family across the generations. When the treatments of his day stripped away the memory and the words that were his reason for living, he could not bear the loss. He was laid to rest here in the mountain town he had made his home. He had lived in Paris among the great artists of the age, had given a name to a whole lost generation, had won both the Pulitzer Prize and the Nobel Prize for Literature, and had become, more than any writer of his century, a figure of myth, his very name, a byword for courage and adventure. But the myth was a heavy costume to wear, and the man inside it grew more fragile every year, tormented by a conviction that he was being watched and pursued, a fear his friends dismissed but which we now know held more truth than they realized. The hospital treatments meant to lift his depression instead erased great swaths of his memory, and for a writer whose whole identity was the ability to summon the right true word, that loss was a kind of death in itself. He was laid to rest here in Ketchum beneath a plain, flat slab of granite, shaded by pines, a simple marker for a man the world had made into a legend, and the shadow that took him would reach into his family for generations more. He rests here now, the giant whose strength could not save him. Let us travel now across the ocean to the garden of Monk's house, in the English village of Rodmell, where the ashes of Virginia Woolf lie beneath a great tree. Woolf was one of the most brilliant and original writers of the 20th century, a woman whose luminous novels reshaped what fiction could do, and whose fierce essays gave generations of women a voice and a room of their own. But all her life, she was visited by a devastating mental illness that came in crushing waves, periods of darkness and voices and despair that no one in her era knew how to treat. In the spring of 1941, feeling another of those terrible descents beginning and certain she would not survive it, she left a note of aching love for her husband, thanking him for the greatest happiness one life could give. And then she was gone, at 59. Her devoted Leonard buried her ashes beneath an elm in their garden, and when he died, decades later, his own ashes were laid beside hers. She had been writing since girlhood, and she gave the world novels of shimmering, revolutionary beauty that dove deep into the flow of human thought and feeling as no one had before, alongside essays whose wit and moral force still ring out today, insisting that a woman needed only money and a room of her own to create art equal to any man's. She stood at the center of a brilliant circle of artists and thinkers, adored by her friends for her dazzling conversation and her mischievous humor. But from her youth, she had been visited by a grave illness of the mind, one that arrived in overwhelming waves of darkness, of sleeplessness and voices, and a despair beyond reasoning, and each recurrence terrified her more, for she remembered how the last had felt, feeling the unmistakable signs of another descent, and unwilling to be a burden to the husband she adored or to lose herself entirely again. She made her choice with a heartbreaking clarity. Her love for Leonard shines through every line of the note she left. With her husband, she had founded a small printing press, and together they set the type by hand for some of the most important books of the century, including the work of poets who would define the age. Her own novels broke every rule of how a story could be told, following the quicksilver movement of thought and memory through a single day, and they remain touchstones of modern literature, studied and beloved 100 years on. But she had been fragile since a childhood marked by loss and by harm, and the illness that stalked her came in cycles she could feel gathering like weather, and having survived several such storms, she knew, with a clarity that is almost unbearable to contemplate, exactly what another would demand of her, and of the husband she could not bear to burden again. The two great elms in their garden they had named for themselves, Leonard and Virginia, and it is beneath one of them that her ashes lie, with his added years later, together still. She rests here now, the genius who gave others a voice she could not save herself with. Let us travel now to the windswept churchyard of Heptonstall, high in the Yorkshire hills, to the grave of Sylvia Plath, one of the most piercing poetic voices of her century. Plath was a dazzling talent from her youth, but she carried within her a depression that had nearly taken her once before she was even out of college. A private agony she would transmute into some of the most searing and beautiful poetry ever written, and into her one shattering novel. In the bitter London winter of 1963, alone with her two small children, her marriage in ruins, she was overtaken by the illness she had fought so long, and she died at just 30. She was buried here in the Yorkshire village of her husband's family, and for decades, admirers who blamed him for her pain would deface the surname on her stone. Her work, published and championed after her death, made her immortal. She had been a golden girl on the surface, brilliant and accomplished and driven, winning every prize. But underneath she carried a depression that had nearly ended her life once already when she was only a college student, an experience she would later pour into her one novel, a book that has spoken to the private anguish of countless young readers ever since. Her poetry, especially the astonishing poems written in the last months of her life, blazes with a fierce, precise, unforgettable power, rage and tenderness and grief transmuted into art of the highest order. In her final winter, she was living in a freezing London flat with her two babies. Her marriage to a fellow poet collapsed, isolated and unwell, and the illness she had battled so long overtook her at last, at just 30. Her genius was fully recognized only after her death, when the collection she left behind made her one of the most celebrated poets of the age, an enduring emblem of brilliance and of pain. Her novel, a searching account of a gifted young woman's descent into breakdown, was published under a false name only weeks before she died, and it has never since been out of print, a lifeline pressed into the hands of the suffering by generations of readers who found their own pain described in it at last. The collection of poems she left behind, assembled and published after her death, secured her place among the immortals and won, many years later, one of literature's highest honors. But her story carried one more heartbreak still to come, for the baby son she left sleeping in the next room that final morning would himself, decades later and grown into a gentle scientist, be lost to the same illness that took his mother, a shadow crossing 2 generations. Her grave in the bleak and beautiful Yorkshire hills bears her married name, and for years mourners who blamed her husband for her suffering chiseled it away, again and again, so that even her stone became a battleground for her memory. She rests here now, the poet whose fire outlived her darkness, Let us travel now south to Mexico City, to the vast and historic Panteón de Dolores, to the grave of Lupe Velez, one of the first great Mexican stars of Hollywood. Velez was a whirlwind of charisma and comic brilliance, a fiery, magnetic presence who lit up the silent screen and then triumphed again in sound, beloved as the star of a popular comedy series and famous for a love life as dramatic as any of her films. But beneath the dazzling, laughing public figure was a woman in deep distress. And facing a personal crisis and the cruel judgments of her era, she took her own life in the winter of 1944, at just 36. Her body was returned home to Mexico, to the country that had first adored her, and she was laid to rest in Mexico City. She had come up from poverty in Mexico to conquer Hollywood by sheer force of personality, a dancer and comedian of irrepressible energy whose fiery temperament earned her a nickname she wore with pride, and whose romances with some of the biggest stars of the age filled the gossip columns for years. On screen, she was pure joy, quick and funny and alive, and audiences adored her. But the same era that made her a star was pitiless in its judgment of a woman's private life, and when she found herself facing a personal crisis alone, with the crushing weight of scandal and shame bearing down on her in a time that offered no compassion and no help, the laughing star could see no way through. She was only 36. Her country welcomed her home in death with an outpouring of grief, mourning the fiery daughter who had gone north and become a legend, and she was laid to rest in the great cemetery of Mexico City, among her own people at last. She had blazed a trail as one of the first Latina stars to conquer Hollywood, working with its greatest directors and headlining her own popular comedy series, her name a guarantee of energy and mischief and life, and her tempestuous romances with some of the most famous men of the age, including a great screen athlete she briefly married, kept her forever in the headlines. But the studios and the public that adored her sparkle were merciless toward the private struggles of a woman alone, and the era offered no kindness and no help to someone in her circumstances, only shame. On her last night, she is said to have prepared everything with great care, and left the world as an actress might exit a stage, and though the tabloids of the day treated even that with cruelty, time has been gentler, and she is remembered now with sympathy and love, as a pioneer undone not by any failing of her own but by the harshness of her times. Her homeland claimed her at last, and she lies in the great cemetery of Mexico City. She had been a genuine trailblazer, opening doors in Hollywood for the Latina performers who would follow, and she did it with a joy and a boldness that never once dimmed upon the screen. She rests here now, the Spitfire whose laughter hid her pain. Let us travel now back to Ohio, to the Oak Hill Cemetery in the village of Glendale, to the resting place of Peg Entwistle, a young actress whose name became a Hollywood legend in the saddest possible way. Entwistle was a gifted British stage actress who had shone on Broadway before coming west to chase the movies, full of hope, but Hollywood was cruel to her, and after a single film and a string of disappointments, the 24-year-old was overwhelmed by despair. In September of 1932, her young life ended at the great Hollywoodland sign that loomed over the city, and in that terrible moment her name was bound forever to that famous landmark, a ghost story whispered ever since. Her ashes were sent home to her father's family in Ohio, and she was laid to rest here, far from the city that had broken her heart. She had trained on the stage and won real admiration on Broadway, a serious and dedicated young actress who came to Hollywood as so many did, certain that her talent would find its reward. But the town that promised everything delivered mostly rejection, her single film role cut down in the editing, the parts she hoped for going to others, and the money running out, and for a sensitive young woman far from home and family, the accumulating disappointments became a despair she could not escape. She was only 24. In the cruelest of ironies, a letter offering her a promising role is said to have arrived at her home the day after she died, too late to reach her. Her death at that famous hilltop landmark, which had glittered above her as a symbol of the dreams that eluded her, transformed her from a struggling actress into an enduring ghost of Hollywood legend, her story retold for nearly a century. Her family carried her ashes home to Ohio. She had been so admired on the New York stage that a young actress named Bette Davis, watching her from the audience, decided then and there to devote her own life to the theater. Such was the spell she cast. But the magic that worked on Broadway did not translate to Hollywood, where she was given only a single small role in a single film, most of it left on the cutting room floor and released only after she was gone, and the rejection wore down a spirit already prone to melancholy and far from the family she loved. Legends have grown thick around her ever since. That a letter offering her a fine part arrived just too late, that her perfume still drifts on the night air near the great sign where her story ended, and whether these tales are true or not, they speak to how deeply her sorrow struck the imagination of the city. Her ashes were carried east to Ohio and placed with her family. A British girl and a Broadway talent come at last to rest in a quiet Midwestern cemetery. She rests here now, the girl whose sorrow became a legend of the hills. Let us travel now to the Holy Cross Cemetery in Culver City, California, to the grave of Charles Boyer, the great French star who was, for a generation, the very definition of romance. Boyer's velvet voice and soulful eyes made him one of the most beloved leading men of Hollywood's golden age. A four-time Academy Award nominee adored in film after film, and in his own life, he was a devoted husband, married to the same woman for 44 years in a town where such things were rare. But he had already endured the unbearable, the loss of his only son years before, and when his beloved wife died of cancer, the grief was more than he could carry. 2 days after she was gone, in the summer of 1978, at 78, he chose to follow her. He was buried here beside her. He had come from France with an accent and a smoldering intensity that made him, almost instantly, the screen's definitive romantic hero, the man women dreamed of and men wished to be, unforgettable in a string of the most beloved films of the 1930s and 40s, and nominated 4 times for the highest honor his profession could bestow. Off-screen he was, by every account, a gentle, cultured, deeply loyal man, and his marriage was a rare island of devotion in a fickle town, 44 years with the woman he loved. But sorrow had already tested him cruelly, for his only child, a beloved son, had died young by his own hand, a grief no parent should have to bear. And when his wife of nearly half a century was taken from him by cancer, the loneliness was simply more than the aging actor could face. He waited only 2 days. He was laid to rest beside her, together in death as they had been so long in life. His smoldering charm had made him a fixture of Hollywood's golden age, unforgettable opposite the greatest leading ladies of his day in romances and thrillers that are classics still, and a shrewd businessman besides. He had helped to build one of the pioneering companies of early television. But for all his suave sophistication on the screen, his heart and life belonged wholly to one woman and to the family they made, which made the sorrows that befell him all the crueler. The loss of their only son, a bright young man taken far too soon by the same darkness we trace tonight, was a wound that never closed, and husband and wife leaned on each other through it for the rest of their years together. So when she was taken from him after nearly half a century of marriage, the world he had known was simply gone, and the elegant, gentle old actor, unwilling to face even a single week without her, made his quiet choice. He lies beside her now. And near the son they both mourned, the 3 of them together at Holy Cross. Theirs had been a true and tender partnership across the decades, a rare and steady devotion in a town that so often chewed such things to pieces. He rests here now, the great lover who could not live without his love. Let us travel now to the Forest Lawn Memorial Park in the Hollywood Hills, to the grave of Freddie Prinze, a brilliant young comedian whose star rose almost too fast to be believed. Prinze was a charismatic, wildly funny young man from New York, of Puerto Rican and Hungarian roots, who became, while still a teenager, the beloved star of a hit television comedy, a trailblazer who made a whole community feel seen on the American screen. But the dizzying speed of his fame, and the pressures and personal troubles that came with it, weighed on a young man who struggled privately with depression. In January of 1977, at just 22 years old, with his whole life seemingly ahead of him, he took his own life. He was laid to rest here in the Hollywood Hills. He had grown up a poor kid in New York City, a natural comedian who could make a whole room fall apart laughing, and while he was still a teenager, that gift carried him, with astonishing speed, to the very top, the star of a hugely popular television series, and a groundbreaking figure who put a proud, funny, Latino face on American screens at a time when there were far too few. He was adored, he was making a fortune, he was performing for presidents, and it all happened almost overnight. But fame that sudden and that young is a heavy thing to carry. And behind the dazzling smile he struggled with depression and with the pressures crowding in on him, personal and professional troubles that pressed harder than anyone around him understood. In the winter of 1977, at just 22, the laughter stopped. He left behind an infant son who would grow up to become a beloved actor in his own right, carrying his father's name forward into the light. He had gone from the stages of small New York comedy clubs to the biggest late-night television program in America while still a teenager, so dazzling and so quick that the whole country fell for him at once, and his hit series made him a genuine star and, more than that, a source of enormous pride for millions who had never seen someone like themselves at the center of an American show. But he had climbed so high so fast that there was no time to build a foundation beneath it, and the drugs and the pressures and the collapse of his young marriage pressed in on a mind already prone to depression. Those who loved him would insist for the rest of their lives that in that final, reckless moment he had not truly meant to leave them, that it was the terrible mistake of a young man in crisis rather than a settled intention, and a court would one day agree. His baby son, less than a year old when his father died, grew up to carry the family name proudly back onto the screen. He had a whole career, a whole life, seemingly stretching out bright before him, which is precisely what made the loss so impossible for those who loved him to accept. He rests here now, the young comet who burned too bright and too briefly. Let us travel now across the ocean to the Montparnasse Cemetery in Paris, to the grave of Jeanne Seberg, an American actress whose luminous promise was ground down by a cruel and secret persecution. Seberg was a fresh-faced girl from Iowa, plucked from obscurity to star in a major film, who became an icon of the French New Wave, her cropped hair and radiant smile unforgettable. But her passionate support for civil rights made her a target of the American government, which waged a years-long secret campaign to smear and destroy her, spreading vicious lies that shattered her mental health and, she believed, contributed to the loss of her baby. Hounded and broken, she struggled with deep depression. And in the late summer of 1979, in Paris, at just 40, she died. She was buried here at Montparnasse, among the artists and writers of the city she had made her home. She had been an ordinary teenager from small-town Iowa, chosen from among thousands in a nationwide search to play a saint in a major film, thrust overnight into a fame she was scarcely prepared for, and she went on to become a genuine icon of European cinema, her gamine beauty and cropped hair defining the look of a revolutionary new wave of filmmaking. But she was also a woman of conscience, who gave her money and her voice to the cause of civil rights, and for that, the secret police of her own country marked her as an enemy, waging a cold and deliberate campaign to ruin her, planting false and cruel stories in the press designed to humiliate and isolate her. The stress of that persecution, she believed, cost her the life of her unborn child, a blow from which she never recovered, and it drove her into a depression that deepened for years. She died in Paris at just 40, far from the Iowa fields where she had begun, and was buried among the artists of Montparnasse, chosen from among 18,000 hopefuls to play a martyred saint in her very first film. She survived a scorching, difficult start to become an emblem of the most exciting movement in world cinema, her image in a newspaper seller's shirt on a Paris boulevard, one of the defining pictures of an era. But her conscience made her generous with her support for the struggle for racial justice, and for that a powerful secret agency of her own government set out deliberately to destroy her, feeding a false and humiliating rumor about her pregnancy to the press. The heartbreak of it, she was certain, brought on the premature birth and death of her daughter, and to answer the cruelty, she held an open funeral so the world could see the truth, but the wound never healed. For years afterward, the anniversary of that loss brought her to the edge of despair, until at last, in Paris, it took her, at only 40. The agency that hunted her would, in time, be forced to admit what it had done. She rests here now, the bright star that a cruel power put out. Let us travel now to the quiet churchyard of Tanworth in Arden, in the English countryside, to the grave of Nick Drake, a singer of such fragile beauty that the world could scarcely hear him until he was gone. Drake made only 3 albums, delicate and haunting records that almost no one bought in his lifetime, and he was a shy, sensitive soul who fell into a profound depression as the recognition he longed for failed to come. In the autumn of 1974, at just 26, he died at his family home, a death ruled to be by his own hand, though those who loved him have wondered ever since whether it was a tragic accident of the mind's medicine. He was buried here beneath an oak in his home village. In the decades since, his once ignored music has found the vast, adoring audience he never lived to see. He was a tall, shy, beautiful young man from a loving English family, a musician of rare and delicate gifts whose 3 albums, filled with intricate guitar and a voice like a sigh, are now regarded as masterpieces, but in his own short life were heard by almost no one. That silence wounded him deeply, for he had poured everything into his music and longed for it to reach people. And as recognition failed to come, he withdrew further and further into a depression that stole his confidence, his energy, and at last his will to perform at all. He returned to live with his parents, who watched helplessly as the darkness closed around their gentle son. In the autumn of 1974, at just 26, he died in his childhood bedroom. Whether he meant to leave the world or whether it was a tragic mistake of a mind clouded by illness, no one can ever truly know. In the years since, his once unheard songs have quietly become beloved the whole world over. He had made 3 quiet, perfect records, and when they failed to find an audience, the disappointment settled into him like a stone, for he was too shy to tour, too fragile for the machinery of promotion, and he could not understand why music he had poured his soul into went unheard. He withdrew from the world, returning to the family home in this very village, where his loving parents cared for him as the illness deepened and the light in him seemed to dim. His death in his boyhood room, at just 26, was ruled to be by his own hand, though the medicine that took him was one meant to heal, and his sister, and others who loved him, have wondered ever since whether it was not a mistake rather than a decision, a question that can never be answered now. What is certain is the astonishing afterlife of his music, which, decades on, found its way into films and advertisements and the hearts of millions, so that the whole world now sings along to songs almost no one heard while he lived. He rests here now, the gentle voice the world learned to love too late. Let us travel now to the Macclesfield Cemetery in the north of England, to the memorial of Ian Curtis, the haunting voice at the heart of one of music's most influential bands. Curtis was a mesmerizing performer, the frontman of a group whose stark, beautiful, sorrowful sound would shape decades of music to come. And he wrote lyrics of startling emotional depth for one so young. But he was gravely ill, suffering from severe epilepsy and a deepening depression, and the pressures of sudden fame and a fracturing personal life bore down on him. In the spring of 1980, on the very eve of his band's first American tour, at just 23, he took his own life. His memorial stone here bears the title of his most famous song, a plea about love coming apart. His bandmates went on to great things, but never forgot him. He was an electrifying presence on stage, a slight young man who seemed to channel something raw and overwhelming through his strange, spasmodic dancing and his deep, grave voice. The frontman of a band whose bleak and beautiful music would echo through every decade that followed and shape the sound of countless artists to come. His lyrics, written when he was barely out of his teens, held a wisdom and a sorrow that seemed impossibly old. But he was carrying more than anyone should. A severe epilepsy whose seizures frightened and exhausted him, medications that clouded his mind, a marriage coming apart, and a depression that all of it fed. On the night before his band was to fly to America for the tour that might have made them stars, at just 23, he was overwhelmed. His grieving bandmates chose to carry on under a new name and became one of the most influential groups in the world, but they never stopped honoring the friend they had lost. His band made only 2 albums in his lifetime, but their stark, cavernous, beautiful sound sent ripples through music that have never stopped spreading, influencing generation after generation of artists who heard in it something true about loneliness and longing. His most beloved song, a heartbreaking meditation on a love falling apart, was released only after he was gone, and became an anthem that will outlive us all. But he was a very sick and very young man, barely out of his boyhood, his body racked by seizures he could not control, his mind clouded by the drugs meant to stop them, his marriage, and his conscience at war within him. On the night before the tour that was to carry him to America, the weight of it all became too much at just 23. His grieving friends resolved to go on, taking a new name and building one of the most important bands in the history of music. But they carried him with them always, and so does everyone who has ever loved that mournful, immortal song. He rests here now, the young poet whose sorrow became song. Let us travel now across the Atlantic to the Avondale Cemetery in Stratford, Ontario, to the grave of Richard Manuel, one of the most soulful voices in the history of popular music. Manuel was a founding member of a legendary group, the man whose aching, otherworldly falsetto and tender piano gave their greatest songs, their broken-hearted beauty, a musician other musicians revered. But he battled addiction and depression for many years, demons that shadowed him even through the triumphs, and though he seemed at times to be finding his footing again, the darkness never fully released him. In the winter of 1986, at 42, while on tour, he took his own life. He was brought home to Stratford, the Ontario town where he was born, and laid to rest. He possessed one of the most extraordinary instruments in all of popular music, a high, aching, soul-drenched voice that could make a listener weep, and, as a founding member of one of the most revered groups in rock history, he gave their finest recordings, their raw, broken-hearted heart, singing and playing piano with a feeling that other great musicians spoke of with awe. But he had struggled for most of his adult life with addiction and with the depression that so often walks beside it, a long private war that persisted through all the acclaim and all the reunions, flaring and flaring again across the years. There were stretches of hope, times when it seemed he had found solid ground, but the illness always returned. In the winter of 1986, far from home on tour, at 42, the darkness won. His body was brought back to the small Ontario town where he had grown up, and he was buried there among his own. His band had emerged from years of backing a rock and roll pioneer to create, on their own, some of the most cherished and influential American music ever recorded, a warm, rootsy, timeless sound, and within it his was the voice that broke your heart, that soaring, quavering, impossibly tender falsetto on songs of rage and release and whispered pines. Fellow musicians spoke of him with something close to reverence, for there was a feeling in his singing that could not be taught. But the same depth that made his music so moving left him defenseless against a depression he tried for decades to drown, and the drinking and the darkness fed each other through all the acclaim and all the farewell concerts and hopeful reunions. On a winter night on the road, far from the Ontario town of his boyhood, at 42, the long war ended. They brought him home to Stratford, and the men he had made music with mourned the sweetest voice among them. His piano and his aching, broken tenor were the very emotional center of the group, and no one who ever heard him sing quite forgot the sound of it. He rests here now, the tender voice that broke 1,000 hearts and, at last, his own. Let us travel now back to Paris, to the Montmartre cemetery on the Hill of the Artists, to the grave of Dalida, one of the most adored singers France has ever known. Dalida, born in Egypt to Italian parents, sold hundreds of millions of records across the world, and was, for decades, a glittering icon of French music, beautiful, glamorous, and beloved almost beyond measure. But her dazzling life was stalked by tragedy, for several of the men she loved most died by their own hands, wounds from which she never truly healed, and beneath the sequins and the spotlights, she carried a terrible loneliness. In the spring of 1987, at 54, she took her own life, leaving a note that said simply that life had become unbearable. She was buried here at Montmartre beneath a striking, life-size statue, and admirers visit her still. Born in Cairo to an Italian family, she rose to become one of the towering figures of European popular music, a singer of smoky, sophisticated glamour whose records sold in the hundreds of millions and whose face and voice were beloved across France, Italy, the Middle East, and far beyond. For more than 30 years, she was, to all the world, the very image of success and beauty and triumph. But her private life was marked by an almost unbearable succession of losses. For more than one of the men she loved most deeply died by their own hands, wounds that never healed and that she carried with her onto every glittering stage. Beneath the sequins and the adulation, she was profoundly, achingly lonely, haunted by all she had lost. In the spring of 1987, at 54, at the height of her fame, she left a short and heartbreaking note and was gone. Her tomb at Montmartre, marked by a radiant statue of her, has become a place of pilgrimage for the fans who adore her still. She had crowned herself with a beauty title as a young woman in Egypt before conquering France and then the whole of Europe and the Mediterranean world. Her deep, warm, unmistakable voice pouring out of every radio for 3 decades in songs that people still know by heart from Paris to Cairo to Rome. She was the very image of glamour and success, but hers was a life stalked by an almost unimaginable procession of grief. For one after another, the men she loved most were lost to the same darkness. including a fellow singer whose death beside her at the height of a great festival wounded her so deeply that she nearly followed him then and there, and never fully recovered in all the years after. Behind every triumphant concert and glittering gown was a woman drowning in loss and loneliness. When she finally let go, at 54, she left only a few words asking forgiveness and saying that life had become unbearable. Her tomb, watched over by a radiant statue of her, remains among the most visited in all of Paris. She rests here now, adored by millions and yet so alone. Let us travel now to the Isle of Skye, off the rugged coast of Scotland, to the resting place of Alexander McQueen, the visionary designer who remade the very idea of fashion. McQueen was a genius of astonishing originality, a working-class London boy who rose to the summit of world couture. His breathtaking, theatrical, sometimes shocking designs, unlike anything the world had seen, the head of great fashion houses and of his own celebrated label. But he suffered from depression, and the sudden death of his beloved mother, to whom he was profoundly close, was a grief he could not survive. In February of 2010, at just 40, only days before his mother's funeral, he took his own life. His ashes were carried to the Isle of Skye, his family's ancestral home, and buried there in the Scottish earth, beneath the words that love looks not with the eyes. He was a genius of pure, untamed imagination, a taxi driver's son from the East End of London who apprenticed on the tailors' row and rose, by sheer talent, to the very pinnacle of world fashion, showing collections that were less like clothing than like theater, dark and romantic and shocking and unbearably beautiful, that left audiences gasping and changed the art form forever. He led two of the most storied names in couture and built a celebrated house of his own, showered with every honor his industry could give. But he suffered from depression, and he was bound by an extraordinarily deep love to his mother. And when she fell ill and died, the grief undid him. Only days before her funeral, in the winter of 2010, at just 40, he followed her. His ashes were carried north to the misty Isle of Skye, the ancestral home of his family, and buried in the Scottish earth beneath a line about love that does not see with the eyes but with the soul. He had clawed his way up from a working-class London childhood, apprenticing among the master tailors before storming the gates of high fashion and blowing them off their hinges. His runway shows less like presentations of clothing than like dark, thrilling works of theater that could reduce a jaded audience to tears or gasps, remaking the entire art form around his singular, romantic, unflinching imagination. He was showered with honors, named the finest designer in his country 4 times over, entrusted with the greatest names in couture, but he had lost, a few years before, the eccentric aristocrat who had discovered him and been his truest champion, herself taken by this same darkness, and he suffered from a depression of his own that the pressures of his dazzling career only deepened. It was the death of his adored mother, though, that he could not survive, and days before he was to bury her, at just 40, he was gone. His family carried him north to the misty island of their ancestors and laid him in the Scottish earth. He rests here now, the visionary who dressed the world and grieved alone. And so we come to the final grave of this first half of our journey, a modern one, and a voice that a great many of us grew up hearing. Let us travel to the Hollywood Forever Cemetery, in the heart of Los Angeles, to the grave of Chris Cornell, one of the most powerful and soaring voices in the history of rock music. Cornell was the frontman of 2 of the most important bands of his generation, a titan of the grunge era whose extraordinary voice and searching lyrics gave shape to the feelings of millions, a beloved, gentle, generous man off the stage. But he had wrestled with depression and addiction for much of his life, a private struggle that his public triumphs concealed. And in the spring of 2017, in Detroit, only hours after a concert, at 52, he took his own life, stunning a world that thought it knew him. He was buried here at Hollywood Forever, near a friend he had loved. When another beloved singer, his close friend, died the same way only weeks later, the double loss forced a grieving music world to begin speaking, at last, more openly about the pain so many carry. He had one of the greatest voices in the history of rock and roll, a soaring, 4-octave force of nature that could shake an arena and then break your heart. And as the frontman of 2 era-defining bands, he became one of the central figures of a whole musical movement. His searching, soulful songs giving voice to the restlessness and pain of millions of young people. Those who knew him spoke not of a rock god, but of a gentle, funny, thoughtful, generous man, a devoted father, a loyal friend. But he had fought depression and addiction since his youth, a private darkness that his soaring public success only hid more completely. And though he had found years of sobriety and stability, the illness was still there, waiting. On a spring night in 2017, after a show, at 52, it took him with a suddenness that shattered everyone who loved him. He was laid to rest here, and when his dear friend was lost the same way just weeks later, a stunned world finally began to talk. He had helped to invent a whole genre of music in the rainy Northwest, fronting a band whose thunderous, soaring songs became anthems for a restless generation, and then a second. And those who knew him insisted, always, that the real man was nothing like a brooding rock star, but rather a warm, funny, deeply kind and generous soul, a doting father who cherished his children above all. Yet he had carried depression and addiction since his youth, and though he had fought his way to years of hard-won sobriety and seemed, to all the world, to have come through into the light, the illness had never truly left him. It took him on a spring night after a triumphant show, at 52, with a suddenness no one could comprehend. He lies here at Hollywood forever, and the loss of his dear friend by the same means only weeks later made the whole world finally stop and listen. He rests here now, the mighty voice that spoke for so many and was, in the end, unheard. And so, friends, we pause. We have stood tonight among painters and poets, actors and comedians, singers and designers, people of extraordinary gifts who brought beauty and laughter and comfort to millions, and who were nonetheless overtaken by a darkness that told them cruel and untrue things about the worth of their lives. At every grave we have felt the same ache, the same unbearable wish that we could reach back through time and tell them what we can see so clearly now, that they were loved, that their pain was not the truth, that the world was and is immeasurably richer for their having been in it. 15 more of these cherished souls lie ahead of us, 15 more stories of brilliance and struggle, and we will walk to each of them with the same tenderness and the same care. Notice, as you rest, how little the darkness cared for talent or fortune or fame. It reached a penniless painter and a Nobel laureate, a silent film comedian and a couturier who dressed royalty, a folk singer no one heard and a rock star adored by millions, and it found them across a whole century and half a dozen countries, in mansions and in rented rooms alike. Their genius bought them no immunity, and their fame, if anything, only made their private suffering lonelier. For how do you confess to despair when the whole world insists you have every reason to be happy? And notice too, the ones who tried to hold on to them, the brother who believed when no one else would, the husband who sat tight by hand beside his wife, the parents who brought their fragile son home to care for him, the friends and bandmates who carried a lost name forward for the rest of their lives. Love was there, in every one of these stories. It simply could not, by itself, cure an illness that needed more than love. And notice, finally, what survived. The paintings hang in the great museums. The novels and the poems are pressed into the hands of the suffering, generation after generation. The songs play on, more beloved now than ever. Not one of these lives was the burden the darkness told them it was. Every one of them left the world more beautiful than they found it, and left us the gift of their work and the lesson of their pain, which is simply this: to be gentler, always, than we know how to be. So rest here a moment among these first 15, and hold them gently in your heart, and when you are ready to go on, we shall continue together, remembering them deeper into this most tender of all the roads we have walked. Welcome back, friends, and gather close once more, for our tender journey is only half walked, and 15 more of these cherished souls are waiting for us in the quiet. In the first part of our walk, we stood among painters and poets, actors and singers, people whose gifts brought light to the whole world and who were nonetheless overtaken by that lying darkness we have spoken of, the illness that whispers to a suffering mind that its pain is endless and its life a burden, when neither of those things was ever true. We come now to 15 more, and among them are poets and novelists whose words still comfort the lonely, painters whose canvases still stop us in our tracks, an actress who gave her strength to soldiers, singers whose voices still pour from the radio, an athlete beloved by millions, and a young man of our own decade whose music still fills the summer air. Their fields and their eras differ, but their stories rhyme, as all these stories do, with brilliance and with struggle, with a light given freely to others and a darkness borne too long alone. And so we walk on in the same spirit as before, with tenderness and without a shred of judgment, remembering not how these lives ended, but how they were lived, and honoring the beauty each of them left behind for us to keep. I will remind you once more, gently, of what these graves have to teach, that the illness which took these souls is real and has a name and, so very often, can be treated and survived, and that the tragedy of these particular lives is a call not to despair but to compassion, toward one another and toward ourselves. If, as we walk, you feel the weight of it, be kind to yourself, and remember that you are not alone, and that the darkness lies to everyone it touches. You may notice, in this second half, how many of these souls left behind gifts that only grew more beloved after they were gone, novels and songs and paintings that found their largest audiences when their makers were no longer here to see it. A bitter irony that runs through so many of these lives. And you may notice too how often someone who loved them refused to let their light go out. A mother who would not stop believing in her son's unpublished book. A daughter carrying her father's voice into a new century. A widow turning her grief into a lifeline for strangers. Hold on to those threads of love as we walk, for they are as much a part of these stories as the sorrow is, and they are the part that heals. So, take my arm again, and lower your voice, and let us go gently among them, beginning with a poet whose delicate verses still whisper of love and loneliness a century on. So, take my arm again, and lower your voice, and let us go gently among them, beginning with a poet whose delicate verses still whisper of love and loneliness a century on. Let us begin at the Bellefontaine Cemetery in St. Louis, to the grave of Sarah Teasdale, one of the most beloved American poets of her age. Teasdale wrote spare, musical, achingly lovely lyric poems about love and beauty and solitude, verses so perfectly made that they won her one of the very first Pulitzer Prizes ever given for poetry, and they are still cherished and recited today. But she had been a fragile, sheltered, often sickly girl, and though she was courted by admirers, including a fellow poet who would himself one day die by his own hand, her life was shadowed by loneliness and by a deepening depression and by ill health that frightened her. In the winter of 1933, at 48, that long sadness overtook her at last. Some of her own poems, written years before, seem hauntingly to foretell her end, so gently did she write of leaving the world. She was brought home to St. Louis, the city of her birth, and laid to rest. She had grown up a delicate and protected child in a comfortable St. Louis family, so frail that she was schooled at home and kept close. And out of that quiet, inward life came a poetry of extraordinary purity, short lyrics of crystalline beauty that spoke of stars and love and the ache of being alive, and that readers across the country took to their hearts. She was courted, in her youth, by more than one devoted man. Among them, a wild and visionary poet whose own life would end in the same sorrow as hers. But she married another, a marriage that in time dissolved, leaving her more alone than ever. As her health failed and her isolation deepened, the melancholy that had always shadowed her verses closed in around her. She wrote often, and with a strange tenderness, of death as a kind of rest, of not minding when it came, so that her poems read now almost as gentle premonitions of the peace she finally sought. For all the fragile stillness of her life, her verse reached an enormous audience, appearing in countless anthologies and set to music and memorized by schoolchildren, a body of work as clear and lasting as spring water. She had a gift for saying the largest things in the plainest words, for capturing in a handful of lines the whole ache of a heart that loves and knows that love and life will pass. And there is one small poem of hers, written long before the end, about how the world would go on in its beauty, indifferent, after she was gone, and how she would not mind, that has been read ever since as a kind of quiet farewell she left for us without quite knowing it. She was carried back to the Midwestern city where she had been a sheltered, dreaming girl, and laid to rest among her family, her sorrows over and her songs, which is what she would have wanted us to keep, singing on. She rests here now, the poet whose quiet songs outlived her sorrow. Let us travel now far to the south, to the mountain town of Petropolis in Brazil, to the grave of Stefan Zweig, once among the most widely read writers in the entire world. Zweig was an Austrian of dazzling gifts, a novelist and biographer whose books were translated into dozens of languages and adored across the globe. And he was, above all, a humanist, a man who believed with his whole heart in a united, cultured, peaceful Europe, and it was the destruction of that Europe that broke him. For as a Jewish man he was forced to flee the Nazi horror, driven from his beloved Vienna across the world to England, to America, and at last to Brazil, watching from exile as everything he treasured was consumed by hatred and war. Believing his world was gone forever, he and his devoted wife chose, together, to leave it, in the winter of 1942, when he was 60. Grateful Brazil gave him an honored grave. At the height of his fame, he had been perhaps the most translated author on earth. His elegant novellas and his vivid biographies of Marie Antoinette and Mary Stuart and others, read and loved in every language, and he had lived at the very center of Europe's brilliant cultural life, friend to its greatest composers and thinkers. A citizen of a civilized continent he believed would endure forever. Then that continent set itself on fire. As a Jewish writer, he saw his books burned and banned, and he was driven into a wandering exile that carried him ever farther from everything he loved, until he came to rest in a small Brazilian mountain town, safe at last in body but broken in spirit, mourning a world that he was certain would never come again. He set down that morning in a luminous memoir, a farewell to the Europe of his youth, and then, feeling he had no strength left to begin again, he and the wife, who would not leave his side, departed the world together, with dignity and with terrible sorrow. He had given the world dozens of books, but he had given it too a spirit, a faith in tolerance and beauty and the brotherhood of cultured people across borders. And to see that faith trampled by cruelty and violence wounded him past healing, in his final letter he wrote with characteristic grace, thanking the country that had sheltered him, sending his blessings to his friends, expressing the hope that they might yet live to see the dawn after the long night, a dawn he felt himself too weary and too old to await. There was no bitterness in it, only an unbearable tiredness and a courteous, sorrowful farewell. Brazil, which had welcomed him, honored him in death with a state funeral and a place of dignity in the earth of Petropolis, and in the decades since, a whole new generation of readers has rediscovered his beautiful books, so that the gentle European humanist, who despaired of ever being read again, is, once more, beloved around the world. He rests here now, the gentle voice of a world that war swept away. Let us travel now to a small country cemetery in Sherman, Connecticut, to the grave of Arshile Gorky, one of the most important painters America ever produced. Gorky was a bridge between the great art of Europe and a bold new American painting, a profound influence on the artists who came after him, his canvases alive with color and feeling. But few human beings have been asked to bear so much sorrow. As a boy in Armenia, he survived a genocide that murdered his people, and he held his own mother in his arms as she died of starvation, a wound that never left him. And then, in the space of a single terrible year and more, catastrophe piled upon catastrophe. A fire that destroyed much of his life's work, a grave illness, an accident that injured the very arm he painted with, and the collapse of his marriage. It was more than any soul could carry, and in the summer of 1948, at 44, he set down the burden. He had come to America as a young refugee and reinvented himself entirely, even his name, teaching himself the whole history of painting and then pushing beyond it into something new, a lyrical, dreamlike abstraction that helped open the door to the greatest movement in American art, so that painters far more famous than he ever became owed him a debt they freely acknowledged. But sorrow had shadowed him from the very beginning, for he was a child of the Armenian genocide, a survivor of a death march, and he had watched his beloved mother waste away and die of starvation in his own arms, an image that haunted him for the rest of his days and that he returned to again and again in his art. And late in his life, the blows came all at once: a studio fire, a diagnosis of cancer, a car accident that maimed his painting arm, the loss of his marriage, one catastrophe after another with no space to recover between them, until at last, in a Connecticut summer, the weight of it all became more than a human heart could hold. His mature paintings, with their tangled, luminous forms and their strange, tender titles, hang now in the greatest museums in the world, and the debt that the celebrated American painters who followed owed to his breakthroughs is written into the history of art, though he did not live to enjoy the full flowering of the movement he had helped to seed. The genocide that had orphaned and exiled him as a boy was a grief he carried in his body all his life, and he memorialized his lost mother in a famous double portrait he worked over for years, unable ever to finish it, painting and repainting her face and his own small childhood hand. That he created such beauty out of such catastrophe is a kind of miracle. That the miracle finally gave way, under a final, merciless avalanche of misfortune, is a sorrow that anyone who stands before his shimmering canvases must feel. He was laid to rest in the quiet Connecticut countryside, far from the mountains of the Armenia he had lost. He rests here now, the painter who survived so much and could bear no more. Let us travel now to the Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale, California, to the grave of Carol Landis, a luminous star of the 1940s with a heart as generous as her beauty was famous. Landis was a popular leading lady of her day, but she is remembered most warmly for her extraordinary devotion to the soldiers of the Second World War, for she traveled farther and gave more of herself to entertain the troops than almost any other star, singing for weary servicemen in distant war zones until she made herself ill. Behind the bright and giving public figure, though, was a woman weary from a string of unhappy marriages, from career disappointments, and from a painful love affair that could not be, and the accumulated heartbreak wore her down. In the summer of 1948, at just 29, she could carry it no longer. Thousands of grieving fans came to say goodbye. She had risen from a hard and impoverished childhood to become a genuine star of her era, a glamorous leading lady dubbed with affectionate nicknames by a doting public, and she worked constantly, in comedies and thrillers and musicals, one of the busiest actresses in Hollywood. But it was in wartime that her truest self shone, for she threw herself into entertaining the troops with a devotion that put nearly all her peers to shame, traveling to remote and dangerous corners of the world, singing and dancing for homesick young men until she collapsed from exhaustion and illness, and writing a book about the experience afterward. Yet for all the love she gave and received, her private life brought her little peace, a succession of marriages that failed, professional wounds that stung, and a love she could not have. And beneath the dazzling smile, the disappointments gathered into a despair she kept hidden from the fans who adored her. Until, still so terribly young, she could bear it no more. She had a warmth and an unpretentious generosity that made everyone who worked with her love her, and her wartime devotion to the troops was not for show but sprang from something genuine in her, a desire to give comfort to frightened young men far from home, and she paid for it in her health, contracting serious illnesses on those grueling tours yet going back out again and again. That same open giving heart, though, left her vulnerable in her private life, and the men she loved did not always love her well, and the town that cheered her on the screen could be pitiless about a woman's romantic misfortunes. When the end came, she was mourned by an astonishing outpouring of grief. Huge crowds gathering at the cemetery, so many of them the young servicemen and ordinary fans to whom she had given her kindness, come to give a little of it back. She was laid to rest in the great cemetery of the stars, remembered not for her sorrow, but for the light and the comfort she had carried to so many. She rests here now, the sweetheart of the soldiers, at peace at last. Let us travel now to the Greenwood Cemetery in New Orleans, to the grave of John Kennedy Toole, whose great comic masterpiece the world would not read until he was gone. Toole was a brilliant young New Orleans writer who poured his genius into a gloriously funny novel, a book bursting with the life and language of his native city. But publisher after publisher turned it away, and the crushing weight of that rejection, together with a mental illness that was closing in on him, drove him to despair. In the spring of 1969, at just 31, he took his own life, believing himself a failure. But his devoted mother refused to let his genius die with him, and for 11 relentless years she carried his manuscript from door to door until at last it was published, and it won the Pulitzer Prize, and it is now beloved the world over. He had been a precocious and brilliant young man, a gifted teacher steeped in the language and the characters of his beloved New Orleans, and into his great comic novel he poured all of it, creating an unforgettable, monstrous, hilarious hero who has since delighted millions of readers around the world. But in his own lifetime, not a single publisher would take it, and the rejections, dragging on year after year, wore away at a mind already growing unwell, until he became convinced that his life's work was worthless, and his life along with it. He was only 31 when he gave up hope. What he could not know was that his mother would prove utterly indomitable, that she would spend more than a decade pressing his rejected manuscript upon anyone who would look at it, refusing every no, until a great novelist finally read it and championed it, and it was published, and it won the highest prize in American letters, and his name became beloved at last, 11 years too late for him to know. His hero, a gigantic, slothful, hilarious misfit railing against the modern world from behind a hot dog cart in the French Quarter, is now one of the most beloved comic creations in all of American literature, quoted and cherished by readers who feel they know the sweltering, chaotic New Orleans he conjured so lovingly. But the young man who created him spent his last years in a spiral of paranoia and despair, taking to the road alone before returning to end his life, convinced that his gift had come to nothing. It was his mother's ferocious, unshakable love that redeemed the tragedy, for she treated her son's manuscript as a sacred trust, enduring rejection after rejection with a stubbornness that would not break until she pressed it into the hands of a writer who recognized its genius. When the prize was announced, she accepted it for the boy she had lost, and the book he died believing worthless took its place among the classics. He lies here in the city he immortalized. He rests here now, the author whose triumph came too late for him to know. Let us travel now to the East Marion Cemetery, on the North Fork of Long Island, to the grave of Mark Rothko, one of the towering figures of modern art. Rothko was a Latvian-born immigrant who became a master of a wholly new kind of painting, vast canvases filled with luminous, floating rectangles of color that seemed to glow from within, works he intended not as mere decoration but as vessels of the deepest human feeling, of tragedy and ecstasy and the sublime, and standing before them, people are moved, often, to tears. But success came late and left him strangely bitter and afraid, and he was besieged by depression, by failing health, and by a crumbling marriage, growing ever more isolated within the darkness of his final years. In the winter of 1970, at 66, he was overtaken by it, in the New York studio where he had made such beauty. He had fled persecution as a child in the old Russian Empire and grown up poor in America, and after years of searching, he arrived, in middle age, at the images that would make him immortal, enormous canvases of soft-edged, luminous color that seemed to breathe and hover in the air, meant to surround the viewer and to speak, without a single recognizable shape, of the largest and most wordless human emotions. People weep before them, and he wanted them to, for he believed his art was about the most basic and profound things there are. He created a whole sacred space of his darkest, most contemplative paintings, a chapel where people of every faith might sit in silence. But the acclaim that came to him late in life brought him little joy and much fear, and he grew suspicious, embittered, and terribly depressed. His health broken and his marriage failing, retreating into an isolation that no admirer could reach, until the darkness closed over him in his studio. He labored over his glowing rectangles with a seriousness that bordered on the religious, mixing his own luminous glazes, controlling exactly how his paintings were to be hung and lit, insisting they be shown low and close so that a viewer might be enveloped by them, might stand inside the feeling rather than merely look at a picture. He turned down fortunes when he feared his work would be treated as fashionable decoration for the wealthy, and he poured his deepest self into that hushed, meditative chapel of dark canvases that still draws pilgrims of every belief to sit in its stillness. But the reverence he demanded for his art, he could not find for himself, and as his body failed and his marriage broke and the black moods deepened, he pulled away from the world into a solitude that grew absolute. He died in the great studio where he had chased the sublime, and he was carried out to a quiet cemetery by the sea on the end of Long Island, the painter of light laid down in the earth. He rests here now, the painter of light who lived in shadow. Let us travel now to the Resurrection Cemetery near Minneapolis, Minnesota, to the grave of John Berryman, one of the most powerful and original poets of his generation. Berryman was the restless, brilliant creator of a sequence of strange and dazzling poems that changed American poetry and won him the Pulitzer Prize, a magnetic and legendary teacher, a giant of his art. But a single wound lay at the root of all his torment. For when he was only a boy, his own father had died by his own hand, an unhealed grief that haunted every year of his life and every line of his poetry. He fought a long war against alcoholism and depression, drawing from that suffering the raw material of his greatest work even as it consumed him. In the winter of 1972, at 57, the old wound claimed him at last. He had transformed American poetry with a wild, broken, brilliant sequence of hundreds of short poems, an utterly original voice, restless and funny and heartbroken all at once. that won him the highest honors his art could bestow, and made him a legend among poets. He was a spellbinding teacher, adored by his students, a towering and charismatic presence. But beneath the brilliance lay a wound that never closed. For when he was only a small boy, his father had taken his own life outside the family's window, and that unfathomable loss shaped the whole of the son's existence. Surfacing again and again in his poems, an inheritance of grief he could neither escape nor lay down. He fought for decades against the alcoholism and the depression that grew from it. And though he wrung great art from his suffering, the suffering did not relent. And in a Minnesota winter, at 57, the same darkness that had claimed his father reached at last for him. His great work gave voice to a character who was and was not himself, a suffering, joking, grief-struck everyman, through whom he could say the most naked things about loss and longing and the terror of being alive. And in doing so, he helped to open a whole new honesty in American poetry, giving later poets permission to write from their deepest wounds. He was a mesmerizing reader and teacher, his lectures the stuff of legend, beloved by students who saw the brilliance and, too often, the pain behind it. But the shadow of his father's death lay over everything, a boyhood catastrophe he circled endlessly in his verse and could never resolve, and the drinking he used to quiet it only deepened the depression underneath. He found, near the end, a fragile hope in trying to get well, writing of it movingly. But the illness was too strong, and in the depth of a Minnesota winter it took him, at 57, closing a circle of sorrow that had begun when he was a very small boy. He rests here now, the poet who inherited his sorrow and made it sing. Let us travel now to the Lincoln Memorial Park Cemetery in Detroit, Michigan, to the grave of Paul Williams, a founding voice of one of the greatest singing groups in the history of music. Williams was an original member and the first lead singer of a legendary Motown group, and it was he, more than anyone, who created their dazzling, precise, unforgettable choreography, the sharp and graceful moves that thrilled audiences the world over. But he was gravely ill with a hereditary disease, and he struggled with drinking and with depression, and the toll of it forced him to leave the group he had helped to build while still a young man. 2 years later, in the summer of 1973, at just 34, he was gone. He was inducted, in time, into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, his contribution to music secure forever. He had come north from Alabama as a young man chasing a dream of music. And with a childhood friend, he built a group that would help define the sound of an entire era. And it was his genius for movement, his sharp, elegant, perfectly synchronized choreography, that gave that legendary group its dazzling look, the spins and steps and gestures that audiences around the world would try forever to imitate. He sang lead on their early records and was, by many accounts, the soul of the group in its beginning. But a hereditary illness slowly stole his health and his voice, and the drinking he leaned on to cope, and the depression beneath it, deepened until he could no longer perform, and he was forced to step away from the group he had helped to create while still a young man. 2 years of decline followed, and then, at just 34, he was found gone, in circumstances that his grieving family would always question. His place among the immortals of music, though, is beyond all question. The group he helped to found became one of the most successful and influential in the history of popular music, and much of what made them electrifying to watch, the crisp turns and the gliding steps and the graceful, unified motion that defined an entire style of performance, flowed from his imagination, for he was their choreographer as well as a singer, the architect of their dazzling stagecraft. Generation after generation of performers has studied and copied what he created, most of them never knowing his name. But the hereditary illness in his blood was merciless, sapping the strength his demanding art required, and as his health and his voice declined, he leaned ever harder on drink to dull the fear and the pain, and the depression beneath it all grew heavier, until he had to give up the stage. That was his life. His death 2 years later, so young, was ruled to be by his own hand, though some who loved him have never stopped asking questions. His genius, at least, is beyond dispute, honored in the highest hall his art can offer. He rests here now, the founding voice whose moves the whole world learned to copy. Let us travel now, across the ocean, to the Morriston Cemetery in Swansea, Wales, to the grave of Pete Ham, a supremely gifted songwriter, undone by the cruelty of others. Ham was the heart of a Welsh band that became the first group ever signed to the Beatles' own record label, and he wrote songs of soaring beauty, including one ballad that became a #1 hit around the world and has been recorded by hundreds of artists since. His talent should have made him rich and celebrated. Instead, a dishonest manager plundered the band's fortune and left them in ruin, and the betrayal and the financial despair crushed him. And in the spring of 1975, at just 27, he took his own life. His daughter was born only a month later and would grow up to honor the father she never met. He was a shy and lovely young Welshman with a rare gift for melody, and the band he led out of Swansea became the very first act signed to the record label the Beatles themselves had founded, a fairy tale beginning that seemed to promise the world. And the songs poured out of him, gorgeous, aching, perfectly crafted, including a ballad of such power that it went to #1 across the globe in another singer's hands, and has been recorded and beloved by hundreds of artists in the decades since, a song that should have secured him wealth and comfort for life. But a corrupt and greedy manager stole the fruits of all that genius, tangling the band in ruin and leaving them, despite their hits, penniless and desperate. And the cruelty and the hopelessness of it broke something in a gentle soul who had only ever wanted to make music. He was just 27. The daughter he never met was born a month after he died, and has spent her life keeping his beautiful music alive. The ballad he co-wrote became one of the most recorded songs of the 20th century, a heartbreak standard that has sold many millions of copies in voice after famous voice, and earned, over the years, a fortune, almost none of which reached the gentle Welshman who had written it. So thoroughly had the band's finances been plundered by the man they trusted. That is the particular cruelty of his story, that his talent was not merely wasted but stolen, that he created enduring beauty and was left with nothing but debt and despair. He kept writing to the end, kept believing in the music even as the business of it destroyed him. And those who knew him remember not the tragedy but the sweetness and the shyness and the extraordinary songs. His hometown has honored him with a plaque near the spot where his band once rehearsed, and his daughter, born too late to know her father, has become the keeper of his flame, so that the beautiful songs he was robbed of in life are, at least, loved and remembered now. He rests here now, the gentle songwriter cheated of everything but his songs. Let us travel now to the Lincoln Cemetery near Chicago, Illinois, to the grave of Donny Hathaway, one of the most gifted voices soul music has ever known. Hathaway was a classically trained prodigy who became a giant of soul, his warm, aching voice and his brilliant musicianship gracing timeless songs of love and hope, some of them beloved duets that remain radio staples to this day. But for years he battled a severe mental illness, a private struggle that his soaring music concealed, one that would lift and then descend again despite the finest care. In the winter of 1979, at just 33, that illness took him in New York City. His young daughter grew up to become a celebrated singer in her own right, carrying his extraordinary gift into another generation. He had been a musical prodigy, raised singing gospel and trained in the classical tradition, and he brought all of it, every ounce of his formidable gift, to the soul music that made his name, arranging and composing and playing with a brilliance that awed his peers, and singing in a voice of such warmth and vulnerability that it could reach right into a listener's chest. His tender duets with a beloved singing partner remain some of the most cherished recordings of their kind, played at weddings and on quiet evenings the world over to this very day. But he suffered from a severe mental illness, one that came in devastating waves and that even the best care of his era could not hold at bay, and it shadowed him through all his triumphs, lifting and returning without mercy. In a New York winter, at just 33, it took him. His little daughter grew up to inherit his glorious voice, and sings on in his memory, so that his gift was not, in the end, lost to the world. He was, by the reckoning of the musicians who worked with him, one of the most complete musical talents of his generation, a composer and arranger and pianist of dazzling ability as much as a singer, a man who could hear a whole orchestra in his head and set it down, and whose recordings still stand as high-water marks of their kind. His holiday song is sung every December by millions who may not know his name. His songs of freedom and hope have become anthems. But the illness that afflicted him was cruel and unrelenting, a darkness that would recede and let him work, and then return without warning to engulf him, defying the best treatment his era could offer, isolating him inside a suffering his gorgeous music never betrayed. He was only 33 when it took him in a New York winter, at the height of his powers, with so much more music surely still in him. His daughter carries his voice and his name forward now, a living echo of the warmth he left behind. Fellow artists spoke of him with an awe usually reserved for legends, marveling that so much musical understanding could live in one so young. He rests here now, the sole voice whose warmth still fills the air. Let us travel now to the Grove Hill Memorial Park in Dallas, Texas, to the grave of Kerry Von Erich, a champion athlete from what may be the most tragic family in all of sports. Kerry was a magnificent wrestler, a muscular, charismatic star adored by millions of fans, and he competed at the very top of his sport even after a terrible accident cost him a foot, a loss he hid from the public, wrestling on in secret pain. But his was a family stalked by unbearable sorrow, for he was one of several brothers, and one after another they were lost, several of them to the same darkness we trace tonight, a chain of grief that broke the hearts of a devoted father and mother and a watching world. In the winter of 1993, at just 33, Kerry followed his brothers. He was laid to rest here beside them. He was the most physically gifted of a whole clan of wrestling brothers, a magnificent, powerful athlete, beloved by legions of fans who filled arenas to roar his name, and he reached the very pinnacle of his sport, holding its greatest championships. He even fought his way back into the ring after a catastrophic accident cost him part of a leg, competing in secret pain, hiding the injury from the crowds who never suspected what he endured to entertain them. But behind the family's fame lay a tragedy so vast it seemed almost like a curse, for his brothers fell one after another, several of them to the same private darkness, until a mother and father had buried nearly all their sons, and the surviving brothers carried a grief no family should have to bear. Worn down by injury and loss and the weight of all those goodbyes, he followed his brothers in the winter of 1993, at only 33, and was laid to rest beside them. The family reunited in the same quiet ground. The story of his family became, in time, one of the most famous and heartbreaking in all of sport. A saga of golden, gifted brothers who thrilled millions and then fell, one after another, in a cascade of tragedy so relentless that people spoke, only half in disbelief, of a curse upon the name. He was the greatest athlete of them all, a champion who carried the family's glory on his shoulders even as he carried its grief, and even as he hid, beneath his tights and boots, the terrible cost of the accident that had maimed him. He wrestled on through pain no one saw, mourned brother after brother, and tried to bear the unbearable weight of being the one still standing. In the end, he could not, and he joined them, at just 33, laid to rest in the same Texas ground that already held so many of them. Decades later, their story would be told to a new generation on the movie screen, and the whole world would weep for the beautiful, doomed brothers all over again. He rests here now, among the brothers he loved and lost and joined. Let us travel now to the Ketchum Cemetery in Idaho, to the grave of Margot Hemingway. And here, our journey circles back to a name we met in its first half. Margot was a dazzling supermodel of the 1970s, one of the highest paid faces in the world, and a movie actress besides tall and radiant and famous, and she was the granddaughter of the great writer whose grave we visited earlier in these very hills. But she carried heavy burdens, an illness of the body, and struggles with addiction and with depression, and the impossible weight of a legendary name, and life after her early fame proved a long, hard struggle. In the summer of 1996, at 42, she took her own life, becoming, most heartbreakingly, the fifth member of her family across the generations to die in this same way. She was buried near her grandfather. Her stone reads, simply, "A free spirit freed." She had burst onto the scene as a teenager, a strikingly tall and beautiful young woman who became one of the most sought-after models in the world, signing a record-breaking contract and gazing out from the covers of every great magazine, and then trying her hand at the movies as well, famous on 2 continents before she was old enough to know herself. But the burdens beneath the glamour were heavy indeed. An illness of the body she had lived with since childhood, a long struggle with addiction and with an eating disorder, and with a depression that would not lift, and, hanging over all of it, the crushing weight of one of the most famous names in the world, a name that came, in her family, with a terrible shadow. For the darkness that took her had taken her grandfather too, and his father before him, and others besides, a chain of sorrow running down the generations. When she let go, At 42, she became the fifth of her family to do so, and yet those who loved her chose for her stone the gentlest of epitaphs. She had been, for a dazzling moment in the 1970s, one of the most famous faces on earth, her striking looks and her exuberant spirit making her the highest-paid model in the world, and she had carried it all with a big, warm, generous personality that everyone remembered. But the very things that had lifted her, her family's legendary name, and her early, overwhelming fame, became weights she could not put down, and when the modeling work faded and the movie career faltered, she was left to struggle, in the public eye, with illness and addiction and a sadness that would not lift. She fought, over the years, to reclaim her health and her happiness, with real courage and real periods of hope, and those who knew her speak of her warmth and her longing to be well. But the shadow that had followed her family down the generations reached her too, and when she finally laid her burdens down, she was buried near the towering grandfather whose blood and whose sorrow she had inherited, the two of them at rest, now in the same mountain ground. She rests here now, released at last from every burden she carried. Let us travel now across the ocean to the Zorgvlied Cemetery in Amsterdam, to the grave of Herman Brood, the Netherlands' most beloved and notorious rock and roll star. Brood was a force of nature, a wildly charismatic musician and a gifted painter both, the closest thing his country ever had to a true rock and roll rebel, adored for his talent and his reckless, burning energy. But that same energy was fed by decades of hard living and addiction that slowly wore him down, body and soul, until he could no longer find his way back to the light. In the summer of 2001, at 54, he ended his life, and a grieving nation turned out in its thousands to mourn the rebel it had loved. He was laid to rest in Amsterdam, the city that adored him. He was, quite simply, the biggest rock and roll star his small nation ever produced, a wild, magnetic, impossibly charismatic performer whose raw talent and reckless energy made him a folk hero, and he was a serious and celebrated painter besides, pouring the same restless creativity onto canvas that he poured onto the stage. His whole life was lived at full, dangerous speed, and his country loved him for it, for his honesty and his humor and his refusal to be anything but exactly himself. But the hard living that fueled the legend also destroyed him by degrees, decades of addiction wearing down his body and his spirit, until the vitality that had defined him drained away, and he could see no path back to the life he had burned through. In the summer of 2001, at 54, he brought it to an end, and a whole nation grieved, thousands lining the streets and gathering at his memorial to say farewell to the beautiful, doomed rebel they would never forget. To his countrymen, he was not merely a musician, but a kind of national symbol, an embodiment of freedom and defiance and pure, uncontainable life. As famous for his outrageous honesty and his gleaming grin, and his refusal to apologize for anything as for his music or his vivid, slashing paintings. He lived exactly as he pleased and said exactly what he thought, and a nation not always known for such flamboyance loved him fiercely for it. But the wild life was not a pose. It was a genuine, decades-long dance with substances that steadily consumed the body and the brilliant, restless mind behind the legend, until the great engine of his vitality simply began to fail, and the man who had always seemed indestructible could feel himself running down. Rather than fade slowly, he chose his own ending, in the summer of 2001, and his grieving nation gave him a send-off worthy of a rock and roll king. The streets of the capital thronged with mourners who understood that they had lost something irreplaceable. He rests here now, the rebel his whole country still remembers with love. Let us travel now to a quiet churchyard in Germany, to the grave of Robert Enke, a beloved athlete whose death changed the way the world speaks of a hidden illness. Enke was a brilliant and gentle goalkeeper, the guardian of his national team, admired for his calm and his kindness as much as for his skill. But for years he had fought a severe depression entirely in secret, terrified that if the truth were known, he would lose his career, and even the little daughter he and his wife had adopted after losing their first child, a small girl, to illness. The fear of exposure locked him alone inside his suffering. In the autumn of 2009, at just 32, that suffering overwhelmed him. But his widow chose to speak openly of his illness, and through the foundation she created, his death became a turning point, giving countless others permission to seek the help he had felt he could not. He was among the finest goalkeepers in the world, the last line of defense for his national team and a beloved figure in the game, admired not only for his brilliance between the posts, but for his gentleness, his intelligence, and his kindness, qualities that made teammates and fans alike adore him. But for years he had carried a crushing depression in almost total secrecy, confiding in only a few, terrified above all that if his illness became known he would be judged unfit, that he would lose the career he loved, and, worse, that the authorities might take away the small daughter he and his wife had adopted after the heartbreak of losing their first child, a little girl, to a heart defect at the age of 2. That fear sealed him inside his suffering, alone. In the autumn of 2009, at just 32, it became too much. And in the wake of the loss, his widow spoke the truth of his illness aloud, and a startled world began, because of him, to speak of these things at last. He had reached the very top of one of the most watched sports on earth, keeping goal for his country and admired across the game. And yet the higher he climbed, the more trapped he felt, convinced that the ruthless world of professional sport would never accept a champion who admitted to a mind in pain. He had already known profound grief, for he and his wife had lost their baby daughter to a heart condition before adopting the little girl who became the joy of his final years, and his terror of losing her too kept him silent about the depression tightening its grip. He hid it with heartbreaking skill, so that even close friends never guessed the depth of his despair. When he was gone, his widow made the extraordinary decision to speak the whole truth publicly, and a foundation was born in his name, and athletes and ordinary people alike found, in his story, the courage to say what he could not, so that a gentle goalkeeper's private tragedy became a gift of honesty to millions. He lies beside his lost little girl, together at last. He rests here now, beside the little daughter he had lost, a quiet man who changed the world. And so we come to the final grave of our long and tender journey, and it belongs to a young man of our own time, whose music a great many of us still carry with us. Let us travel to a peaceful cemetery in Stockholm, Sweden, to the grave of Avicii. Tim Bergling, known to the world as Avicii, was a shy, sweet, prodigiously talented young Swede who became, while still barely more than a boy, one of the biggest musical stars on the planet. His joyful, soaring songs, the anthems of a generation, played on every dance floor and every radio in the world. But the crushing pace of that fame, the endless touring and the relentless pressure, wore terribly on a sensitive young man, and it damaged his health and his spirit. And though he bravely stepped away from touring to try to save himself, the darkness had taken hold. In the spring of 2018, at just 28, he was gone. His heartbroken family created a foundation in his name to fight for mental health and against suicide, so that his loss might help to spare others, and his beautiful music plays on. He had begun making music alone in his boyhood bedroom, a shy and unassuming teenager with an extraordinary ear. And almost before he understood what was happening, he had become one of the most famous musicians alive. His exuberant, heartfelt anthems topping charts in every country and filling the greatest festivals and arenas on earth. The joyful sound of a whole generation's youth. But the machinery of that fame was merciless, an endless churn of travel and performance and pressure that left no room to rest or heal, and it broke down his health and darkened his gentle spirit. And though he found the courage to walk away from touring while still in his 20s, hoping to save himself, the damage had gone too deep. In the spring of 2018, far from home, at just 28, he was lost. His shattered family founded a foundation in his name to fight the very despair that had claimed him. And around the world his bright, beautiful music plays on, as full of life as ever. He was, by every account, a sweet and modest and slightly shy young man, more comfortable making music alone in a studio than standing before the roaring crowds his talent summoned. His songs married the joy of the dance floor to a deep and often melancholy longing, and they became the soundtrack of countless young lives. But the relentless demands of superstardom, the touring that never stopped, the pressure that never eased, hollowed him out and harmed his health. And when he finally found the courage to step off the treadmill and try to heal, the world worried for him but hoped. That the darkness took him anyway, at just 28, struck his millions of fans like a personal loss. His family turned their grief outward into a fight to save others, and his radiant music, undimmed, plays on wherever people gather to feel alive. He rests here now, the young light of a generation, still singing to us all. And so, friends, our long and tender walk among these 30 souls comes to its close. We have wandered from a wheat field in France to a churchyard in Sweden, across a whole century and half the countries of the earth. And at every grave, whether it belonged to a painter or a poet, an actor or a singer, a wrestler or a fashion designer, we have found the same heartbreaking truth: that a gifted and beloved human being was overtaken by a darkness that told them cruel and untrue things about the worth of their life. Not one of those things was true. Every soul we have visited across these 2 nights was loved and left the world richer and more beautiful than they found it, and would have had so much more to give had the illness that took them only released its grip. That is the hardest part of all these stories, and it is also, if we let it be, the most important lesson. Because the darkness that took them still moves through the world, and it still tells the same lies, to the famous and the unknown alike, and it may even, on its worst days, whisper to someone hearing my voice right now. So let me say to you, as plainly and as gently as I can, that if you have ever heard those whispers, they are lying to you. Your pain is real, but it is not the truth about your life, and it is not forever, and you are not a burden, and the world is immeasurably better for your being in it. Reach out to someone you trust, to a doctor, to one of the kind voices waiting on the other end of a helpline, for help is real and it works, and so many people who once stood where you may be standing are alive and glad today. Do it for yourself, and do it too, in memory of these 30 beautiful souls who could not, so that their stories might save a life they never got to meet. Remember them, then, not for how they left us, but for the light they left behind. The paintings and the poems and the songs, the laughter and the beauty and the love. There is a reason we have walked this hard road together, you and I. And it is not to dwell in sadness. It is because remembering these souls and telling the truth about how they suffered and how they died is itself a kind of medicine, for it drags the old darkness out of the shadows where it does its worst work and holds it up to the light where it is weaker. For most of history, these deaths were whispered about, or hidden, or shamefully misnamed, and that silence cost countless lives, because a person who believes their pain is unspeakable is a person who suffers alone. So when we say these names plainly, and grieve these losses openly, and refuse to look away, we are doing something quietly powerful. We are breaking the silence that the illness depends upon. Let that be the gift we carry away from these 30 graves. Then, a little more courage to speak, and to listen, and to ask the people we love how they truly are, and to answer that question honestly, ourselves. The kindest thing you will ever do may be as simple as sitting with someone in their darkness and refusing to leave, or as simple as letting someone sit with you in yours. Rest well, dear ones. All 30 of you, adored in your day and adored still, and never ever the burden the darkness told you that you were. And rest well to you, my companions, who walked this tender and difficult road beside me and did not look away. Be gentle with one another, and be gentle with yourselves, and until we walk together again, good night.